So yeah, the camera died. So now we're continuing our unit. So this is part 2 of agency. I'm going to bring on my timer, presuming the camera doesn't die on me again. So where we left off is we were talking about deity agency A and what a common assumption it is. Now, not necessarily in psychology or psychotherapy theory, but in terms of the therapist's personal lives, as well as the client's personal lives. So, as an aside, it's interesting in the research we were doing a couple of years ago, and we did this research for about 3 years. So we have numerous presentations, a couple of publications out of it. One of the things that we found is deity agency A, what we're calling in this class deity agency type A, was associated with rigidity, perfectionism, and deity agency type A people, or those with those assumptions and beliefs, tended to be very reactionary in their Mormonism. So while they are LDS, they're very letter of the law, hold on to the iron rod so tight they lose all circulation to their brain. And then they're actually more likely to leave the LDS church proportionally to those who have other agentic assumptions. And when they do, they're likely to engage in a reactionary dynamic there, that if Mormonism says do these things, A, B, and C, and now that I'm not Mormon, now I have to do anti-A, anti-B, anti-C. So, although only maybe 30% of people who leave the LDS church, and this follows along with other Christian churches as well, it's about 30%, their lives kind of fall apart because this black and white thinking, black becomes white and white becomes black, and they flip. But you'll notice it's only about 30% because deity agency A is not the preponderant assumption amongst Christians. And so it seems to belie most of the messages in Scripture that for Christians, God has a very broad plan for you, not a specific who you should marry, what you should drink, what car you should drive. That is a micromanaging God. And some people say, well, man, it says in Scripture that God is always already involved in all things. Yes, but not in the way you're taking it up, right? God is involved, like my little Hyundai is outside, and I think the electrical system's shot. The battery's okay, but it won't respond. You put the key in, nothing. All the everything's totally, utterly dead. God has been very much involved in that car. It was a very good car for me. Then my daughter drove it for a while, and now my youngest son is driving it, and I think it may be done. And so it wasn't that God planned for us to have that specific Hyundai. It's that we live in a world where through various things I don't deserve, I was blessed enough to have a little beater car, and I'm very grateful for that. And God is involved from this other point of view in my attitude of gratitude, in my very much appreciating that, yeah, it's just a little beater car, but man, it kept getting me places I needed to go. So God has a very general plan for you of unity, of joy, of salvation, of eternal life, right? That's a very broad plan. How you get there are 1,000 million different ways, and God's not going to micromanage all of that. So instead, there's another way of taking up godliness, God stuff, and that's contextually. So this is the deity agency B people are like Christian agentic contextualists or other religions. Like the Buddhists tend to be very contextualist and more deity agency B. And so what I mean by that is in deity agency B, they tend to be very, very Christian, regardless of their, Catholic or Methodist or Presbyterian or Baptist or Mormon. They tend to be very Christian in the sense that they really listen to the messages of the archetypal Jesus, where so what did Jesus say? Well, it's very clear in the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? I have come and I fulfilled the law, meaning the law of Moses, this need to have rules for everything and God to micromanage your life. Christ says, okay, I fulfilled that. You guys don't need that anymore. What you need is to love one another. And that is the commandment. And then later in the Gospels, the Christ figure dies for that commandment. And so we'll talk about this more when we talk about Christian psychotherapy. So as this deity dies for that particular commandment, as this God figure dies, God doesn't tell you how to love, only that you should. And it is the context of that particular relationship that informs how you love and why you love, and how, well, the why is because, it's the way to be according to God, but how you love very specifically. And so the context is the one you navigate, hopefully prayerfully and humbly and with this, with gratitude, etc. The loving into a given relationship is on you and informed by that context, and God isn't going to micromanage that context for you. So what do I mean by that? Okay. So if I'm understanding these Christians correctly, let me look at three. Let's see, how many people are living in my house right now? 5, counting me. So 4 people other than myself. So my beloved is downstairs teaching chemistry. Can you imagine teaching chemistry in this format? It's fun to watch her work, and she's really good at it. It's just, talk about creativity. Like, she's teaching chemistry this way. And so, how do I love my wife? Right? How do I love my sweetheart? In what way does the context of who she is inform how I love her? Okay. Oh, that's a very good question. So, my wife isn't a gift person. She doesn't really give gifts of monetary value, and she doesn't really receive gifts of monetary value. She's grateful when she gets them, but it's not what means the most to her. Like, it took a few years of our marriage where I'd really save up my little college student pennies, and I would get her a nice piece of handmade jewelry from one of my friends or colleagues, and she was so grateful to get it, and then the jewelry would go into her jewelry box, never to be seen again, right? It wasn't really what was deep. The gesture was meaningful to her, but not the thing itself. So gifts, not it. No, instead she seems to really, really appreciate 2 things. It's what the love languages people call words of affirmation and quality time. Like, that's where she is at. And because of my way with the English language, I have no problem offering eloquent words of affirmation in her direction. So, and that's far more meaningful. That doesn't go to the bottom of her jewelry box, right? She smiles and she beams when she hears these words on the daily. And so likewise, quality time. With how busy she and I are, we carve out time. It's usually Friday nights and Saturday mornings. We don't do anything else. We run errands together, we hang out, we talk, and that time is extremely meaningful for her. So therefore I love her in that way. If I had a different spouse, then I would be loving them in the way that was compatible to the context of who I am in that particular relationship. So by way of contrast, for example, I have 2 surviving children here at home. Diamelin, who's 20, and Jareth, who is 16. And Diamelin and Jareth I love dearly and differently. Diamelin is my adventure child. So, to give you an idea, one day, for example, if you're to sit down at my monitors, so in my gaming station I have these huge monitors that surround my very big overstuffed comfy chair, and that's when I'm in the video game murder, death, kill, demon zone, right? I'm going to conquer this planet full of demons. And so when I'm in my video game zone, I've got one monitor on the game, and then my other monitors do other things, like they scroll through slideshows of the various pictures I've taken through the years. And Jareth was coming up to talk to me about a video game I was playing, and as we were talking, he noticed that there was slide after slide after slide of Diamelin. And he just looks at me and he goes, Diamelin is your favorite child. And of course I'm chainsawing down a demon, die, mega demon, and I go, yep, she is. And he says, see, I knew it. And I go, yep, you're right. And he was butthurt and pouting, and he goes, how is it okay for you to say that? And I said, well, you just need to wait a minute. Like, literally, you need to stand there for 5 minutes. And he goes, why? Butthurt. And I go, because you have asserted and I've agreed that Diamelin is my favorite child. Now, you need to wait right there. You are not my favorite child at the moment, apparently, so you will wait because seems like I'm arbitrarily punishing you. I wasn't. So a few minutes later, a bunch of pictures of Jareth start coming up, okay? The series of pictures we're the adventure children. Like Diamelen, when I say, okay, I'm going to hike Mount Nebo today, I'm going to summit Mount Nebo, who's coming with me? Diamelen always says yes. If I say, hey, I'm going to go shooting today, who wants to come with me? Diamelen says yes. When I go, hey, I'm going to go to this knife fighting seminar on American Bowie knife dueling, who wants to come with me? Diamelen says yes. Jareth always says no. He doesn't like hiking. He doesn't like shooting. He doesn't like the exertion of knife fighting. He doesn't like that stuff. And so therefore, I love Diamelen around adventure things, of going and doing things, and we love to go and do things together. But Diamelen and I don't sit around. We don't sit around and talk. That's how I relate to Jareth. So with Jareth, I love him in the sense that we play role-playing games, and we play video games, and like I started my kids on Dungeons and Dragons at a young age, and it's been a meaningful part of their lives. And Jareth has just run with it. He's like a DM in 2 different groups, and he's very good at it, and so that's where we are. That's our love language, metaphorically speaking. There, with Diamelen, it's adventures, new restaurants and new experiences and vistas and new hikes and things like that. With Jareth, it's this new D&D book came out for the game, and let's talk about how that has new special abilities or spells for our characters. And so I said, do you see, Jareth, that Diamelen is my favorite kid when it comes to these adventurous things. You are my favorite kid when it comes to these creative things. And so therefore, in the context of adventure, obviously Diamelen and I spend more time together because you're not interested in that. And yet, when it comes to these other things, the more contemplative, creative things, Diamelen's not as interested in that, and you are. So therefore, I love you in this context. And so, I'm hoping that gives you an idea. Like, I love one neighbor, the neighbor's right across the street from me, by never talking to them. I know that sounds weird, but when we moved in, they could tell that we are the people who are just like out on our porch hollering at folk and, being friendly. And when we moved into this particular house, they very sheepishly, 2 of them came across the street, they gave us a loaf of bread and said, we can tell that you're the people who know everybody, please leave us alone. And I went, you want me to leave you alone? Is that important to you? And they said, yes, please would you just leave us alone. And so I took the bread, I thanked them, and I looked them very deep in the eye, and I said, I vow to never darken your door. I vow not to acknowledge you when you come out of your house. Is that sufficient for you? And they said, oh, yes, thank goodness. And so I did. The husband later died of hepatitis C, miserable, etc. No one darkened their door. No one went there, right? And much to their relief, they would rather be deprived and starving to death than allow the intrusions of those who care. Now, some of you would say, Matt, that's not very loving, and you're right. I'm using that in a sense ironically. In hindsight, what I should have done is done just what I did and allowed them to suffer the logical consequences, because sometimes love is letting people suffer. And then check with them maybe once a year. Can I be friendly now? You know what I mean? I think that would have been more loving in the long run. At the time, I didn't know. I didn't find out that the poor man had died in horrible distress until months later. And so, whereas with other neighbors, it's barbecues and hanging out, chatting over the fence, helping them with yard work. It's things like that, right? It depends on the neighbor. And so, therefore, when we say love thy neighbor, the neighbor that we are loving is a big part of our loving of them, as well as who we are. Like, one of my neighbors needed help fixing his car. I'm mechanically incompetent. I was the kid who hated Legos. I appreciate that you like Legos. Let me not like them. I let you like them. And so I didn't like Legos or erector sets or anything else. I still don't. I'm mechanically inept. And so therefore, I'm the one who holds the flashlight and gets the pizza while they work on the car, right? That's what I can do to love them. So in DD Agency B, God commands you to love and then asks you to figure out how to love in the context of who you are and those that you love. And so if I understand these authors correctly, that God is a part of that loving and even takes the loving of your neighbor as love for this deity figure. So that's DD Agency B. It's like, okay, how are you going to love? How are you going to be compassionate? How are you going to serve? I've just asked you to do this. I've got everything else taken care of, right? You will be saved. Allow yourself to be transformed in a loving way by the beautiful and painful experiences of living. I've got your back. Please be loving. And so, now, there's an interesting flip side to this, by the way, and I really enjoy this, that there's deity agency A and B thinking amongst atheists as well. It's so badass. It's really cool. But of course, they don't call it deity agency. In fact, they don't call it agency at all. That's what I call it. But here's the way it manifests. It's nature agency A and nature agency B, or evolution agency A and evolution agency B. I kid you not, it's really cool. Here's how it works. So evolution agency A is this belief that you can either go with or against the forces of evolution, right? They just substitute evolution for God. And it's really neat. It's like a one-for-one substitution. And so that you just substitute the word evolution anywhere the Christians use the word God, and they accept it. So there are things that are more evolved, things that are healthy. Like, we'll talk about hedonism, and we'll have a unit on hedonism and altruism here coming up in a little while, but really what they're saying is if it feels good, do it, because evolution is telling you to do this thing, right? The pleasurable things that we do with our bodies, like eating is evolutionarily adaptive and feels good. Sleeping when we're tired is evolutionarily adaptive and feels good. Having sex when we're horny is evolutionarily adaptive and it feels good. And so basically they're like deity agency A, but it's evolution agency A, that evolution micromanages your whole life, and you can either go with evolution or go against evolution. And so it's really neat that they're just as black and white thinking, just as perfectionistic, only they substitute the word evolution or Dawkins or Darwin or Hitchens or whatever else for God and prophets and everything else. It's so cool the way they do that. And they're often not aware of it, and when I tease them about it, they sure as hell don't appreciate it, but they can't deny that I'm right? They've just swapped God. God's in control, the evolution is in control. I've got so many stories I wish I had time to tell. Okay, and then nature agency B or evolution agency B is, there are in general ways to live a more evolved life, and they typically are more social evolutionists, and they're less black and white thinking, and they also don't think that evolution controls us. Instead, they tend to take it up as evolution is something we participate in. So as a society, as a species, what are we doing, and what effect will that have on future generations, and how will they participate in not? We're becoming more technologized. We are, in America, for example, when you look at population growth and population density, our population has moved out of rural centers throughout the Midwest and South and moved towards the coasts. And so therefore our population density along the coasts is extremely high, but the population in the Midwest is getting lower and lower all the time. So what does that mean in terms of how we live, how we will survive, those kinds of things? So I've only met a couple of these evolution agency B type people. They're very interesting, and they ask very compelling questions. That the one rule is survive, right? And so how we survive depends on the context of where we're at, and therefore we are a part of the act of survival. Just like the deity agency B people, you're all part of loving and how you love. For the evolution agency B people, it's all part of survival. How do you survive? How do you help other people survive? They tend to be more social evolution, that we are not evolved singularly, but we evolve together. Really cool stuff. I wish we had time to do a whole unit on that. Regardless, I want to sensitize you that. Like a little while ago, a deity agency A student popped off, and evolution agency A student popped off, and they started fighting in my class, and I had to shut it down quite sharply because they're both engaging in the same kind of second dimensional binary thinking, right? It's all black and white, and they were using the same terms, and just one would use evolution, one would use God, and they would bash each other with it. And I'm like, see, this is type A. This is type A thinking right here. It's second dimensional, very binary thinking. So, not that they liked me calling them out like that, but we needed to talk about other things that day, rather than just watching those two fight. So later we'll have a unit again on Christian therapies, on Buddhist therapies, and I hope you'll see more of the very fourth dimensional way in which they take up commandments, the way they take up the commandment to love or to be compassionate or gracious or grateful, that it's very, very contextual. Okay? So it's like deity agency B is contextualist, but emphasizing transcendent spiritual kinds of things. Okay, so there's a lot of problems with deity agency A and B, which I'm sure you're intuiting. Deity agency A fails phenomenologically because the vast majority of people don't feel compelled or controlled by a god. And that when they do the God thing, it doesn't always work out for them and often doesn't. Now, there are a few that it does for, but it's random and variable, so it's not predictable. Whereas the DD agency B people, a lot of their behavior requires a deity or a transcendent figure for their behavior to make sense. And that doesn't necessarily apply. Like, how are you loving as you write an email? Well, I guess that does apply. Anything that has to do with other people, it applies. But what about like choosing ice cream? They've got nothing to say whether you choose the sweet ash ice cream or you choose the goat ice cream. They don't, by the way, bonus points if you know what I'm referring to. So they don't have anything to say there. To DD agency A and B people, a lot of the small decisions we make in our life aren't really decisions. They don't talk about them, they're not interested in them. So that's why we have other models of agency, like classical agency. So classical agency is defined as the capacity to do otherwise, all things remaining equal. And you're like, Matt, you just read it right from the notes that's in Files on Canvas. Yes, I did. So it's the capacity to do otherwise, all things remaining equal. Now, you'll notice that this is an ex post facto understanding of agency, right? That this is an after the fact, whereas the others are prospective, or meaning looking ahead, or current and contextual, meaning looking at this particular moment or the event of the choosing. For classical agentic thinkers, it's all things being equal, was there something that prevented you or caused you to make this particular choice or not? If there was nothing that was causing your choice, then you had agency. If there was something that caused your choice, then you didn't have agency. So it's very retrospective. We tend to find these more like in forensic psychology or in law psychology, like courts of law, that it's, okay, so you committed this crime, and then all things being equal, was there something that caused you to commit this crime or not? So, camera just made another noise. And I don't know why, because it shows it's still recording. So, was there something that caused you to make that choice or not? Now, an advantage of classical agency is all sorts of choices then are subject to their examination. Like with free will, that there's, like with the free will thinkers, that they can wonder. Now, unlike free will thinkers, they will ask whether or not there was a choice happening, all things being equal, was there actually a choice that happened there? Or was the choice caused by something else? And so, whereas free will thinkers think that we're always already choosing. So, the problem with classical agency, as I'm sure you're aware, is that it is only retrospective, or mostly retrospective. That when we're, like, let's say you and I go to Rockwell Ice Cream, that's what I was referring to earlier. And so, as we're lining up and they have their 28 flavors of ice cream, I tend to get the same things, right? If there's a certain ice cream available, I will get that ice cream. I'm very particular. And yet, if they have multiples of my favorites, then choice suddenly comes into the picture. If they have a chocolatey or a peanut buttery kind of ice cream, I will always choose those first, especially if they're chocolatey and peanut buttery together, right? Unless there's sweet ash available. Yes, they literally make ice cream out of ash. And so if they have sweet ash available, I will always choose that to the exclusion of others. If they have chocolatey and peanut butter and sweet ash is not available, then I will choose chocolatey and or peanut buttery stuff over all the other ice creams. If they have multiple chocolatey or peanut buttery things, that's when choice suddenly exists, okay? Because now I have to choose between the possibilities that are available to be chosen. Because I mean, if you give me a cup of sorbet, I will thank you and I will eat it and I will enjoy it, but I won't enjoy it as much as, say, a dark chocolate ice cream or a dark chocolate peanut butter ice cream, right? So those choices only become available when they are there to be chosen. I will never choose sorbet if there's a chocolate or peanut butter, therefore there's no choice. All things being equal, there was not a choice there, okay? But if I have a chocolatey and a peanut buttery one and they're in the same cooler and I can choose between them, suddenly choice exists, okay? So that's why it's very much involved in legal thinking. And we see this in therapy amongst our colleagues who, like, if a client's relapsing on a drug or engaging in a compulsive habit that they're trying to break or other things, when the therapist looks and see, was there anything causing you to make that choice? No? Okay, then you chose that. and therefore they hold those clients accountable. Not meaning they necessarily shame them, although I've seen therapists do that, but instead understand, okay, well, that one you didn't really have a choice, so therefore we'll try again, right? And you hopefully will in the next situation. So somebody's saying, Matt, doesn't that overlap with contextualist agency? And it does a little bit. The difference, though, is the facticity of the choice and what is available to be chosen or not. It's like contextual thinking, but more black and white. There is choice or there isn't. And it's retrospective, whereas contextualist thinking is here and now and prospective, like what's going on right now and looking ahead in terms of what choices, like possibilities and constraints, are always already acting on choice. For classical agentic thinkers, it's, okay, retrospectively, in that moment that you chose, was there anything causing your choice? If there was, then it wasn't a choice. If there wasn't anything causing your choice, then it was a choice. Okay, so classical compatibilist, that's another. So we've talked about free will, contextualist, deity agencies, both A and B, and classical agency, meaning all things being equal, did you choose? So classical compatibilist is our next option. Classical compatibilism is a way to have your free will and your science too. Like, that's really where it comes from. And I find this delightful and frustrating at the same time. So classical compatibilist is, you take a pie chart, okay? And in that pie chart, add all of the variables in one of the behaviors you chose today. All the nature variables about biology, physiologically, neurochemistry, etc., all of those causes to your behavior, and then all the nurture variables, all the way you were programmed through space and time to behave this way. Anything left over after you measure all the nature variables, all the nurture variables, that little sliver that's left is free will. Okay? That's the percentage of your behavior that was due to unconstrained, unconstrainable choice. And again, how this evolves is oftentimes we have an intuition of choosing. We have a feeling that we have chosen, and that choosing is a real thing that people do. And I've noticed we tend to hold other people accountable and tend to treat them like they're choosing things. From that guy that cut you off in traffic to your girlfriend cheating on you, we tend to hold them accountable like they're choosing their behavior, right? And so we have this intuition that we have chosen, and we have an intuition that other people have chosen. And so therefore they want to keep that. At the same time, though, they want their science to be valid. They want their science to be real, in the sense that there are real causes to our behavior, nature and nurture causes to our behavior. So they want to be able to measure those and talk about those while still having room for their experience of free will. I love this crap, man. I mean, I think it's a spurious and idiotic philosophy, but I love that they're trying to have their science and free will too, because science is all about what causes something, right? A causes B. There's no room for free will in that, and they keep trying to insert free will into it. And so, 93% of your behavior was nurture, 6% was nature, the 1% left over was free will, and they really talk about it that way. And yes, there are psychotherapies that evolve out of this kind of particular model. And that is that they want to be able to do biological interventions about, say, the biological causes to your addiction, your depression, your sexual compulsion, whatever else. And they want to do therapies to undo the damage of your past, depth psychologies or cognitive psychologies, etc., to undo those. And then hold you accountable for how much you participate in these therapies that they're doing for you. And so it's built on a cognitive compatibilist model. A classically compatibilist model, not a cognitive compatibilist model. We'll get to that in a minute. So a classically compatibilist model, that nature and nurture, whatever is left over, is free will. So therefore they can acknowledge that your behavior is determined by your biology, and they can acknowledge that your behavior is determined by your past, but somehow you still have a choice in that. Okay. So it's up to the scientist, i.e. the scientific therapist, to determine where that choice actually lies, and not to hold the clients accountable for what they can't choose, but only hold them accountable for what they can, and then to encourage them to make the right choices in those tiny domains of their life where they actually have some semblance of free will. So, unfortunately, free will makes anything non-scientific. So therefore, some more sciencey types in the field of psychology developed another model of agency called cognitive compatibilism. So classical compatibilism, we measure all the nature and nurture variables, what's left over is free will. Cognitive compatibilism is different. Cognitive compatibilism is we have the experience of choosing, but our choices are predetermined by nature and nurture variables going into the act of choosing. Okay? Meaning that if we're at Rockwell Ice Cream and I think that I'm choosing the chocolate peanut butter ice cream, then I have had that experience of choosing, but a cognitive scientist would have predicted my choosing the chocolate peanut butter ice cream in advance. Okay? Meaning that all of our choices are actually predetermined. But they keep emphasizing, no, you still chose, it's just that you didn't know that your choices were caused in advance. And so they have this very interesting doublespeak in cognitive psychology where, yes, you chose, and they'll insist that you did because you had the experience of choosing, but then they define choice as the experience of having chosen even when you didn't choose. I love this. This is so idiotic. It's amazing. Like, some of you are sitting at home going, man, I don't know if I'm smart enough for graduate school. People with PhDs came up with this. You can too. And there's a glorious career ahead of you. Do it. It's awesome. Like, this is an important idea. It doesn't hold water for very long when you think about it critically. But it's an important enough idea that, you know, textbooks upon textbooks are written assuming this cognitive compatibilist theory that if we could just, in fact, Steven Pinker, he's a cognitive evolutionary psychologist, he says it the best. He says that if we can measure all of the variables, we can predict human behavior with 100% accuracy. What we need to get better at is measuring all of the variables, right? He likens human behavior not as like a boulder rolling down a mountain, but as an avalanche of various variables that are going on within the shape of the mountain and the shape of the valley, that we need to measure every little grain of sand, every twig, every boulder that's tumbling down the mountain, as well as the shape of the mountain itself, as well as the valley itself. But if we can, then we can predict human behavior with 100% accuracy, meaning we really don't have a choice, because if we could choose, then it wouldn't be predictable. And so, but he insists that we do have the experience of choosing, therefore we have a choice. And then other people say, Stephen, having experienced a choice and actually choosing are not the same thing. And he goes, yep, and then ends the conversation. So, actually, Steven Pinker is a very sophisticated thinker. And so you can see some of his TED Talks, for example. He's a charismatic fellow. Has a lot of interesting things to say. So, cognitive compatibilism, we think we're choosing cognitive, right? It's all cognition, cognitive thinking. But they want to reconcile our experience of having chosen with the science that says we can't actually choose anything. And so that it's all predetermined by nature, nurture, laws of physics kinds of things. Well, that leaves us with determinism. Determinism is like the anti-agency. And this is far more common in the sciencey side of psychology, where they'll acknowledge and they talk about if we could just measure all of the variables, that we could predict human behavior. But they say that the feeling of choice doesn't matter. Like choosing means an actual choice, cognitive compatibilists. You didn't actually choose, right? You thought you did, but that's what they call epiphenomenal. Epi, meaning apart from phenomena, the experience. That the truth that your behavior is predetermined is apart from the experience of you having chosen. So therefore we don't even talk about the experience of you having chosen, because you didn't. It was always already predetermined by nature and nurture variables. It was caused in advance. And so determinists don't take up human beings as having any semblance of choice or free will, etc. And I really get a kick out of that. I don't see that as much in the therapy field. Amongst the cognitive therapists, I see it from time to time. I really see it amongst the behaviorist therapists. Besides that, it's pretty rare. Having known, though, these therapists, is I love that they take up their clients as determined beings, but they don't necessarily take themselves up as determined beings, and they certainly don't do it in their personal life. They still hold people accountable and still praise and punish and reward and those kinds of things. All of which implies that the entity in question had a choice in their behavior. So, a lot of hypocrisy amongst, or a lot of inconsistency rather, amongst these various theories. So, here's something that we get to wonder. What do we assume? Like, what do I assume in terms of agency? when I look at how I treat other people, like if I'm driving in my car and somebody cuts off so close I have to slam on my brakes or I lose the front of my bumper, what do I assume about that person's behavior? Are they being a jerk, an asshole, etc.? Meaning, are they choosing to engage in this aggressive behavior? And is that my assumption? And so, you son of a, right? Blame, right? Because praise and blame require agency or require free will. Or do I tend to have that immediate habit of wondering, wow, is this guy on his way to the hospital? Like, I wonder why he's such a hurry. I hope he's okay. Like imagining what the context might be for this particular other driver's behavior. When I walk in, thankfully this hasn't happened with me or with my sweetheart, but I walk in and I find my lover in flagrante delicto with one of my siblings, right? They're doing naughty grown-up-y things of an X-rated variety together. Do I assume they had choice and therefore I go for divorce because I feel so betrayed? Or do I go, oh, we're just all determined by our behavior, so therefore nature nurture variables cause them to do this, and nature nurture variables are out of our control, so, what do you actually assume about human agency? If somebody promises to pay you back the $20 they owe you, do you hold them accountable, right? What do you actually assume? What do you actually believe? Are there similarities and differences between what you assume and what you believe? How you actually respond in the moment versus the story you tell yourself? That's the question. That's what will make you a good therapist. Isn't that they get along, that they gel or don't gel. That's not the point. It's the point of awareness. And if you're in the business of helping people become aware, because that's what the majority of therapy theories say this activity is, then by golly, you need to get good at becoming aware. And so that's why we practice these things. So one of the things that I would like you to do, and I would encourage you to do, is go through and review every one of these forms of agency and say, okay, if somebody is a free will therapist, how will they approach therapy? What does that imply, that assumption of free will imply about how they treat other people? If they're a contextualist, deity agency A or B, classic agency, classical compatibilist, cognitive compatibilist, determined, how will they do therapy? So let me give you a leg up. Let's try determinism. If you assume determinism as a therapist, you see yourself as a determining force in the lives of your clients. It is your job to program them or biologically modify them or both to change their behavior. If the client is not, here's an implication, anything the client does then is caused by you. So if they're getting better, it's because you are causing them to be better. If the client is not getting better, it's because you are failing, right? Therefore, you are the causal agent in the client's change. Now let's compare that to free will. Free will, you can freely choose to do what you can do with the client, and they can freely choose what they do about the therapy. So therefore, if the client is really struggling in therapy or not really engaging in therapy, it's because it's up to them, right? They've chosen not to really engage in therapy. And therefore, you might resent them or call them out or refer them out because they're not choosing to engage. Okay, let's throw a contextualist in there. So a contextualist finds that one of their clients really isn't engaging in therapy. The contextualist's gut response is to wonder what all is going on in the client's context, that they are pulled in other directions outside of or apart from the therapy frame. Okay, so are they distracted because of work or home, or that thing with their kid? Is there something going on in the here and now relationship with the client that they're struggling to engage more? To what degree is it something I'm doing, or I think it factors outside of my control, right? They're likely to think in that way. Okay, so I want you to do this exercise on your own. Break down each one of these theories, these meta theories. What is going on with a free will thinker in terms of therapy? How will they actually do therapy? How would a contextualist actually do therapy? How would a deity agency A therapist actually do therapy? And tell yourself the story and see if it makes sense. Look at how each one of these theories of agency are similar and different from the others. Okay? Some are pretty radically different, like free will and determinism, but many of the agencies are approximate, like you can't really put them on a continuum. They overlap a little bit, like the contextualists overlap a little bit with compatibilists and the classic agency people. And so really try to gel a story to yourself about how each one of these folks will vary a little bit from the others in terms of how they actually respond to their clients. How much time do I have left? Okay, good. We've got a few minutes. So we have hit hard the notion of accountability, like agency and determinism, and moral accountability. That agency relates very deeply to moral accountability. So we'll hit this harder in the forensic psychology class, although some of you, I appreciate, are graduating and won't be able to take that class. But we'll really break down and show how it is that in the eyes of the courts, in terms of the legal philosophy in the United States and much of Western Europe, you're only legally accountable for the things you choose or not choose, okay? So crimes of commission, crimes of omission, etc. are all based on choice and all based on the assumption of choice. And it even comes out in legal language. So the other thing that we can do very briefly, because I know we're just about out of time today, not out of time today, but out of time for this particular video, is we can look at our dimensions of thought and examine these various assumptions of agency. Free will, you'll notice, is very categorical thinking. It's very first-dimensional thinking, right? It can bridge into second-dimensional thinking if somebody adds in you either have free will or you don't, right? And that's kind of like the classic compatibilists, and sometimes even the classic agency thinkers. And so it's everybody has choice. Let's talk about what choice is. So everybody has free will, right? Everybody has this kind of choice called free will. Let's talk about what it is. Then when we add some of the others, it becomes second dimensional. And so deity contextualist is very fourth dimensional. There are simultaneities of possibilities, simultaneities of constraints. They're all going on right here, right now. It's all very contextual and relational. Deity agency A is very binary thinking. It's very second dimensional thinking. Deity agency B is kind of binary thinking. You're either living love or you're not. However, the ways to live love are in the context of your loving relationships. So it's like, it has a little bit of a second dimensional feel for it, but when you really get into it, it's actually very fourth dimensional. Then classic agency is, again, it's a little bit binary thinking. It's a little bit, did you have agency or did you not? Classic compatibilist is also kind of binary thinking, second dimensional thinking. You either have it or you don't. You know, what percentage of this choice, which can get into, kind of nudge in the direction of fourth dimensional thinking, like they're trying to, and I appreciate that they are. Cognitive compatibilist is, again, it's unary thinking. It's first dimensional thinking. We don't actually have choice. Let's just talk about the causes of behavior. And likewise, determinism is very first dimensional thinking. So every one of these meta theories we talk about, from the dimensions of thought to agency to causality, epistemology, moralities, etc., all of them co-inform one another. Like, it'll get to the point, I hope for many of you, at least this is typical in the 25 years, wow, I've been teaching this class, is that most students begin to see, like towards midterm, sometimes towards the end of the semester, that all they have to hear is one sentence from a thinker, and they can begin to guess with nothing's ever 100%, but it's rarely 100%. But oftentimes they can pretty accurately begin to guess, well, if I hear what they believe, or if I hear a statement that assumes some very strong causal things, that I can begin to backtrack into agency and track forward into epistemology and morality. That they begin to see how it is all of these ideas are interconnected, such that if they're reading an idea here, they can see where all of those connections probably unfold. Okay, so we're out of time for today. I'll go ahead and get this video uploaded. Our next unit will be on causality, and we'll have a couple of hours on causality. Okay?